Welcome to our new show, Superintendent's Office Hours. I am here with Superintendent Pivovar, and I am so thrilled that you allowed us to come in with our cameras and ask you some of the questions. We have crowdsourced all of these questions from our community, and we'll continue to do so each episode, and we'll come back to you hopefully monthly to ask some of the questions that the community is asking. So first, let's start with, during the MSBA study of the Sheehan School, there were some obvious mechanical failures and improvements that need to be made to the physical building. But how do you plan to address some of the safety concerns and spatial needs?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you, Melinda, to the folks from WMC for being here. Very happy to do this. So as it relates to the Sheehan, it's part of the larger context of doing an overall master facility study. That funding was approved last year. We're in the process of doing that study. We anticipate the results coming out sort of late winter, early spring to really socialize with the community around where we are. And there are two major parts of that. One is an itemization for all of our buildings, not just Sheehan. And particularly Sheehan and Thurston are the ones that have the most intensity around needs right now. That really itemizes what are the needs in those buildings with a greater level of specificity than was done the last time around with the MSBA feasibility phase. The second thing is actually about looking at long-range options for the schools. So for example, what we don't want to do is look at doing like a 20-year replacement project for a roof if we're going to have a conversation about replacing a school 6 years from now. So we want to prioritize those things that are first and foremost going to ensure the safety of students that will be in that building during its lifespan, but at the same time don't want to put good money after bad by investing in things that may not have the return on investment because of the shelf life of the building as a whole. We're going to be developing options. The goal is not to come out here with one finalized option, but we want to have multiple options to look at, which then we can socialize with the community to figure out what's going to be best for Westwood.
So just so that the community understands and that I'm understanding, one of the improvements that you plan to make is the electrical at the Sheehan. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so for example, at this spring's town meeting, there's going to be a warrant article to replace an electrical panel at Sheehan. That's the kind of thing where, in a best case scenario, if we said, okay, somebody cashed in a lottery ticket and there was money and we were able to build a new Sheehan today, it's still about 6 years away from opening at a minimum. The reality is the electrical system in that building, again, to ensure the safety of students and staff, can't wait 6 years. So we need to invest in that right now to make sure that we can maintain that level of safety in the building. As opposed to some other things that we're going to have that conversation before we decide whether or not that's the right investment.
Right. I think some of going kind of back to the initial question of spatial and security I'm more referring to as in the front door, right? Because most of the other elementary school now have a front door, a vestibule, and almost 2 points of contact before, and Sheehan doesn't have that. And the spatial issues came up right during the MSBA. That's why the Pine Hill, it was built like it has. It has special spots in the hallways where specialists can take kids out, or two teachers can collaborate on one thing in a coordinated effort in like a different area. Is there any short-term consideration on either of those issues?
Yeah, so it's premature for me to answer that question until we have that study that comes out, right? So I don't want to speak too much with specificity here. At the same time, like when we talk about this being a facility study, it is not just about pipes and boilers and windows and roofs. It's about the building and what can happen educationally inside. So we went through a whole educational visioning component. We're going to be releasing our final portrait of a graduate shortly, which really informs what we want to do with education. And so there is it was critical with this to make sure that the educational piece was part of the study. Because ultimately, the physical infrastructure of a school is only as good as the kind of education it can support inside of it. So while it is premature to talk about what solutions may be out there in the immediate offering, certainly when we look at long-range solutions, that's an integral part of the process going forward.
Switching gears, there have been some reports of turnover amongst the special education staff. How is the district planning to prioritize staffing in this particular area?
Yeah, so there certainly has been turnover, and that's, some of those are natural attrition through retirement, and we wish those that have retired certainly the best for a long and happy retirement. And I would say that the issues around being a special educator is a really, really hard, demanding job. And the challenges with staffing are something that are happening statewide and nationally as well too. I think the fact that we have made some moves here in last year's budget, hiring a director of human resources and now building out an HR infrastructure in the district, is going to allow us to find the best to come in and work in what's an amazing school district. And to be able to allow us to move forward. Part of that involves things like creating formalized partnerships with some institutions of higher education. We already have an intern program with one university that's been in existence for a while, and if we can find great people that can come in and intern and then become permanent employees for us, that's really a great thing, and we're looking to try to expand some of those opportunities in the future.
So we've heard through social media channels, we've seen the discussions at school committee. What will be done to address the Thurston Middle School facility concerns? It seems like there's a huge immediate need, and to ensure the safety of all and create a comfortable environment for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo back to some of what I talked about in the response to the Sheehan question initially, right? Which is that we are doing the study. The study is going to itemize those things, and we're going to prioritize the work that we do first and foremost around health and safety of students and staff. There's only so much we can do with a building that I would say, I guess, semi-affectionately refer to as a Depression-era building. It was built in 1939 with an Eisenhower addition in the 50s and a Clinton wing added in the 90s and some modulars tacked on. And so we are going to, through that study, identify, okay, what is the cost of basically maintaining that building and doing the work we need to do versus what's the cost of looking at a more permanent solution. And then again, that's going to come down to, we know that Sheehan has significant levels of needs as a building that was opened in the 1940s. We know that Thurston has significant levels of needs. And that then leads to the community conversation around, okay, what do we prioritize from a facility standpoint? What do we prioritize from an educational standpoint, knowing that it's not an either or conversation? There's a phrase that the MSBA uses, which I think is really apt and appropriate, which is that we want to find the most educationally appropriate and cost-effective solution for our building needs. It's not an either-or conversation. We need to do both because ultimately whatever we decide from a facilities perspective has to make sure that it prepares the generation of students coming through for what they need for their futures. But we also know that it comes at something that the town has to be able to financially support through the tax base. And so it's a both-and conversation.
Okay. You've referenced the facility study a few times. Can you explain to the public a little bit about that process and where, and timeline-wise, where you see that unfolding?
So that work really began late last spring and in the summer, where we had hired Doran Whittier as an architecture firm. It's the same architect that worked on the Pine Hill School, to come in and do this, develop a long-range master plan for us for the school facilities. So the initial phase involved sitting down with principals and other stakeholders to understand how our buildings work, to understand what the challenges we have are from a conversational perspective. Then they brought their engineers and architects into the buildings to look at all the nooks and crannies and in the basements and all those kinds of things to identify what the physical needs of the buildings were. Parallel to that, we went through this educational visioning process. As I said before, it's about what kind of education can our buildings support. So we need to know what kind of education do we want for our students in 2030 and 2040 and beyond, and so that we can design options that relate to that. So the two deliverables, which we both anticipate again sort of late winter, early spring, will be a capital improvement list that identifies an articulated list for every building with cost estimates. Here's what needs to be done to make this the kind of educational facility we can, given the bones that we have right now. As well as, here's a set of long-range options. What's the cost of and let me not presuppose sort of what's going to come out, but what is the cost of this kind of a new construction? What is our estimated cost? What is the estimated cost of doing some kind of a renovation project? What's the cost of doing nothing? Because there is a very real cost of doing nothing, and that's continued maintenance and repair for a subpar facility. And so once we have all that information on the table, then the next phase is we work to socialize that with the community. And so I am happy to talk with anybody at any place, anytime around that, and I'm sure we'll have further conversations about this in future episodes. But to talk about what are the implications, because ultimately that's going to be a community-based decision because of the implications as it relates to cost and where we want to head.
Right. Going back to using Doran Whittier, they were instrumental in the Pine Hill. They seem to be also on the new FS1.
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit of why it's important to, or why you chose, or anybody chose to work with Dorn Whittier again.
Yeah, so we had to make sure that we followed procurement laws, right? So we had an open RFP process for the facility study, and we had a number of firms that we interviewed as a part of that. I also personally have had the experience working with them before in a master plan in the former community I was in. And as it relates to this particular project that we're doing, I am really impressed with their ability to think strategically and long term. Again, knowing that what we want to do is understand the implications of the decisions we make today and what the impact will be educationally and financially 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. The fact that they already have an intimate knowledge here in Westwood of some of our buildings based upon the work that they did in feasibility when Pine Hill was done, you referenced their work with Sheehan earlier. The fact that they have a sense of the context of the town, having that level of continuity is really strong. Now, that being said, the last study that was done by a school department was not by Dorn Whittier. It was done by another firm, Sims Bainey McKee, SMMA, back in, I think, 2015. And so they used that as a jumping off point. But at the same time, they had a different perspective, having not looked, for example, at Thurston before. So being able to take the results the district had done previously, taking what they know of the community from the work that they've done to really help us develop a really strong product.
Great. Okay, switching gears. There were some changes to MCAS requirements this year. Can you talk a little bit about how that affects high school graduates?
Yeah, so there's still some uncertainty at the state level about what the passage of question 2 will mean going forward. The short version is that students no longer have to students no longer have to pass the MCAS in order to graduate from high school. The reason they had to pass the MCAS was something known as the CD, the competency determination. The competency determination does not go away, and it now falls on local districts to determine what their competency determination is. What the school committee here has done, and they recently passed a minor change to the graduation policy that aligned with question 2, because, for example, the state will no longer identify what does passing on MCAS mean. Our previous policy said students had to pass the MCAS because that was the state requirements. It's no longer a state requirement, and passing isn't even a thing anymore because they fall into the category of not meeting expectations, partially meeting expectations, or exceeding expectations. For the vast majority of students who complete our identified graduation requirements through our program of studies at the high school will meet the requirements for a competency determination. There's going to be some conversation that we need to have about some of those nuanced situations. We have the benefit of some time because that's not something we're concerned about for students in the current class of 2025. And so right now we're going to wait for some further guidance from the state. But for the vast majority of students, the kind of education that we already deliver to students here at Westwood High School, and for the district, pre-K to 22, means that students are on track to graduate with the requirements. Students do still have to take the MCAS. The MCAS itself does not go away. That continues to be a federal requirement, so that students have to be tested, and that will continue, just as it has in grades 3 through 8. But from a graduation requirement perspective, students that are meeting what we've outlined, the English and math and science and world language and other credit requirements in our program of studies, students that do that will have earned the CD.
What will the data be used for?
When you say data, what do you mean by?
MCAS, personalized MCAS data that your child accumulates year after year.
Yeah, so we, in the same kind of way that it's done in 3 through 8, like we use that data internally for planning purposes. We don't want to rely on any one singular piece of data as the be-all, end-all to talk about how a student is doing. So we use that in concert with other test results, with what happens with local assessments, with report cards, with attendance, to identify those students that are doing well, and we can continue to doing what we're doing with them, and those students that we may need to provide a little extra support to. So on a school-based level, that's what it's used for. On the state level, it's still used for accountability determinations. That is not a significant concern here in Westwood. I think that applies more in other communities than it does ours. And then what others decide to do with it, that's a very open question. But as an individual parent, it provides a snapshot for your child, or as a parent or caregiver, it provides a snapshot for your child around how they're doing. But it's not the be-all, end-all of their performance. You should be looking at multiple points of data, and it's our job to provide that in context.
Would one of those points of data be the STAR report as well?
Yeah, it's so, for example, like in the younger grades, right, the STAR report is certainly something that would be, you look at MCAS, you look at STAR report, you look at report cards, you look at, individual tests that come home. You look at attendance, all those things. The what happens in a caregiver teacher conversation. Those are all really important pieces of data that talk about the holistic nature of how a student is doing in school.
What is the status of the Deerfield Task Force? And once they've made a recommendation, what's the procedure that you'll follow to figure out what to do with it?
Yeah, so the Deerfield Task Force, we have another meeting that's going to be scheduled in late February. I don't think that's been posted yet, but it'll be posted shortly. It's been on a little bit of a holding pattern, knowing that we want to have the results of the facility study or be further along with that, because that is going to be really informative for what the Deerfield Task Force will recommend. So to be clear about what that committee's charge is about what are the potential educational uses for Deerfield, and whether or not the school committee should continue to maintain Deerfield as an asset. It's not about I know that, from the moment I walked in the door a year and a half ago, I heard from lots of different people with different ideas for what Deerfield could be used for. The task force limited charge as to what falls within the school committee's control and jurisdiction. So they will make some recommendations to the committee, and then the committee will decide whether or not or how to act on those recommendations. I think our intended initial timeline was to try to have something by the end of this end of the school year, essentially. But again, that's contingent to some degree on the facility study results.
Is the Deerfield building part of the facility study?
Yeah, so it absolutely is part of the facility study. That's being reviewed as well. And I should acknowledge, for those that may not be aware, the Deerfield building itself is currently being used by municipal departments. So it's being used by the town's recreation department. It's being used by the town's IT department, because it is an asset in the community, and we want to make sure we're taking advantage of that asset while we're figuring things out from a more longer term perspective.
All right, last question. Your most recent February 3rd email that you had sent to parents and caregivers explains that the FY26 budget revisions that you've made, right? Can you take us through the process your team did to accommodate a 4th classroom for preschool and to keep Mandarin at WHS? And are there any other cuts made to include those 2 priorities?
Yeah, so from a process perspective, we certainly heard the feedback from the committee at the meeting on January 16th. We also held a meeting with stakeholders shortly after the school committee meeting. We wanted to make sure we heard from preschool stakeholders directly. As it relates to other cuts being made, because of the adjustment that we did, and it related to the phase-in of wellness, we were able to, the 3 areas that were outlined in the February 3rd memo from me were the only areas that we're recommending a change to the budget. There are no other areas in the budget that are being changed as a result, because we're able to make the dollars work as it associates with that. So there are no sort of like hidden increases or decreases elsewhere in the budget beyond those 3 things from what were presented on January 16th. There's a whole lot of creative problem solving that takes place, right? I mean, I meet regularly with my team here in central office. We meet with the principals and other members of our administrative team to really be responsive to the feedback we hear from the committee and the community. I don't want to get too much into the details of how those conversations take place, but ultimately, a budget is about values, and a budget is only as good as the level of support that can be brought behind it. So I'm hoping the changes we've made, the committee will vote on those at their meeting on February 13th. I'm hopeful that they'll go forward, and that we'll be able to move forward for FY26 in the 2005-26 school year.
Great. Superintendent Pivovar, thank you so much for your honesty during this conversation, and we look forward to sitting down again. And if you have any questions for the superintendent, please feel free to submit them through our form, and thank you for watching today.